Thank you so much, Victoria. Okay, recording in progress. Thank you so much, Victoria, for your nice and kind introduction. And yeah, so I will just, without further ado, as people tend to say, I will just begin my presentation, which will be, as you can see on this first slide, about Zeno of Elea and Rošker. It will be a comparison. I will compare them through the method I am developing. I've been developing during the recent years. This is the so-called method of transcultural philosophical sublation. And we will compare them through the lens of the so-called flying arrow problem. Well, for those who don't know about this flying arrow problem, it will be explained more in detail a bit later. First, I would like just to say a few words about why I have actually started developing this new comparative method, what was actually the motivation for it, and at the same time, why I am very happy to reply, to answer such invitations as this one from the Forum of Greek and Ancient Greek and Ancient Chinese philosophy, for which I'm very grateful. I would like to thank, of course, express my heartfelt thanks to Dimitra and Anna for inviting me. It's been a great honor. So it is all about comparative philosophy and intercultural dialogues. And I think that such dialogues are really very important, especially in current era, because the crises we are facing as humanity today are all interconnected. There are global crises. They cannot be solved in the narrow confines of individual states. They require genuine transcultural dialogue on an egalitarian basis, on a basis which is not exclusive, but which follows the paradigms of what Gayatri Spivak has called planetarism. So this kind of establishing this kind of dialogues where really different traditions, including the non-Western, non-European traditions, can talk, exchange knowledge and ideas with each other is today, in my view, more important than it was ever before. So, but establishing such dialogues, of course, is maybe easier to say than really to do, because there are many obstacles which are first of all, of methodological nature and also of political nature. We can start with the simple fact that if we are doing such transcultural research, we are very quickly confronted with the fact that concepts and categories cannot be simply and directly transferred from one socio-cultural context into another, because some of their semantic connotations do overlap and some don't, and these meanings are prone to change across different contexts. So we cannot just understand them through a word-to-word literal translation or interpretation. What we need to take into consideration here are what I call the so-called referential frameworks. What are referential frameworks? It is more or less the same thing that Thomas Kuhn, in his famous book about the structure of scientific revolutions, has called a paradigm. But in this context, I think that the term paradigm is less suitable because it is too broad. Paradigm, as we all know, just means a kind of a very basic pattern. of dealing with reality. So I prefer to use the term referential framework. And what are referential frameworks? In my view, they are a kind of semantic networks which include all concepts that are being used in a certain theory. They define the meaning of each concept, but not only of each particular concept, also the meaning of relations, of mutual relations between different concepts, and in the end also the meaning of the whole network as such. Now, these referential frameworks are actually phenomenon that is not only important when we are dealing with transcultural research, where we use different. Oh, somebody started to mow the grass now in front of my window. I hope you don't hear it. I hear it and it's a little bit disturbing. But okay, so it is not only a question of transcultural philosophy, because the problem of referential frameworks is also important when we the referential frameworks, it is really disturbing. The referential frameworks can also occur in one and the same culture. For instance, Feng Yaoming, a very famous analytical philosopher from Hong Kong, has exposed that we can, in this regard, remember the Newton's and Einstein's theories of physics, although they were shaped in one and the same culture, actually in the Western culture, and although they were both written in Indo-European languages, there were no big grammatical differences or linguistic differences, and although they have used basically the same concepts, these concepts have had a completely different meaning because they were part of different referential frameworks. And in this dialogue, in this slide, you can see actually how Thomas Kuhn describes what happens at the so-called paradigm shift. This is a shift when prevailing theory, a prevailing referential framework of a theory is being replaced by another. So we can see that this has very far-reaching consequences and implications, because it can change, if the theory is really influential, it can change the basic worldview or the basic cosmology of society. So, of course, as I just said, referential frameworks are important to be taken in consideration even when dealing with theories that were shaped in one and the same culture. But if we are dealing with two regions that have historically developed in mutual isolation, where the systems of belief, systems of production and reproductions, systems of structures of grammar, political systems, ideologies, and so on, where they differ a lot, then this problem becomes even more severe, because the more apart are historically these two regions, the greater is the possibility that the differences in the referential frameworks into which their theories are embedded will also be very large. So, and this is also connected to the question of comparative philosophy as such. So recent controversies in academia have clearly shown that the concept of comparison itself is already rather a problematic one, even if we are not dealing with transcultural research again, or transcultural comparison, like the one we will be presenting here. but these problems certainly become even more complex when we are dealing with transcultural philosophical comparisons. So Rafael Banca, for instance, has exposed that the main problem of doing transcultural comparative research lies in the fact that we are using one single methodology and one single philosophical language, not only in the sense of terminology, but also in the sense of what lies behind it. So, and then we use this single philosophical language and single philosophical methodology on research in particular in culturally discrete and different regions and discourses. So I agree with Rafael Banca in this sense, but I think that the problem goes even further. And the problem is that, namely, in my view, if we are dealing with East-West comparisons in philosophy, we still tend to use the unified methodology and the unified language, philosophical language we used, tends still to be the Western one, which leads us then to a very bizarre situation, actually. Because if you look at this classical schema of theoretical schema of comparisons, it consists of at least two comparata. These are the objects of comparison. And then with the element, which is an external element, which is outside, it is called the third of comparison, or more noble in Latin, tertium comparationis. So, and this third element of comparison is actually implies the methodology according to which we are comparing. It implies it includes the criteria according to which we are evaluating both comparata or more comparata, and so on. So this element, it is very important that this element is external, so it can guarantee some objectivity in the results we gain from this comparison. But the bizarre situation we are confronted with in comparing Western and Chinese, for instance, philosophy is that this tertium comparationis, the third of the comparison, is mostly a part of one of the two comparata, namely the Western one. So many people, many scholars recently have tried to avoid or somehow to surpass these problems, and maybe the three most well-known new approaches that were based on this basis of so-called post-comparative approaches are philosophy of fusion, philosophy of synthesis, and philosophy of confluence. And my new approach, it is one among many. It is not better and not worse than the others, but people work also in different ways, and different methods are suitable for different people. This method is suitable to the way I'm working in comparative philosophy. It was published in this book that came out in the beginning of this year. So why do I call it a method of sublation? As we all know, sublation is a translation of Hegel's term Aufhebung. So many people, if they, as soon as they hear that I'm working on a method of which is called sublation, they automatically think it is a Hegelian method. But I have to disappoint them. This method has not much to do with Hegel, nor with his model of dialectics, although it is also a dialectical method in itself. So, but the difference is severe, because Hegelian dialectics is a form of identitarian philosophy, to speak with Adorno, which is based upon the basic laws of formal logic and on the concept of being and identity. The method of transcultural sublation, on the other hand, is also a dialectical kind of comparison, but it functions in accordance with the principle of correlative complementarity, which was developed in traditional classical and traditional Chinese philosophies. So, but if the method has nothing to do with Hegel, why do I still call it sublation? I call it sublation because the term sublation or Aufhebung in German has three distinct meanings: eliminating, preserving, and elevating. And in the process of applying this method, some elements are being eliminated from the both comparata. Some of them, more constructive ones, have been preserved, and then our thought was elevated to a new level. So these three connotations, all these three connotations are very important for the method as such. This method functions, as we will see, in according to eight distinct phases, which are building up each other. So the first phase is we formulate a research question, then we define similarities, then we identify differences, but not differences between the comparata, but differences between that can be identified within these similarities. Then we link these differences that we have just identified to the respective preferential frameworks into which the theories of the two or more comparata are embedded. Then this makes it easier for us to identify flaws or insufficiencies in each comparata. Nothing is perfect. Of course, you can find flaws and insufficiencies everywhere if you really want to. And then in the next phase, we establish a model of mutual complementarity between the two comparata. We take the strengths of both comparata and try mutually fulfill the flaws that the gaps that have occurred because we have eliminated certain elements. Then due to the tension that is being accumulated between the comparata in this process of dialectical interaction, we are then confronted with a sublation in a narrow sense, sublation as a shift. And this leads us then to the final phase where we hopefully gain a new perspective or a new idea regarding the research question. But this is, of course, now all very, very, very dry and theoretical, so you probably cannot really imagine how this method concretely works. So in my book on sublation, the first part was devoted to the theoretical description of the method, and in the second part, it was exemplified on many different examples. So as you can see, one of these examples is also about the fourth in the first row, is also about Huische, Zeno, and the problem of the flying arrow. And I have, of course, as soon as Anna and Dimitra have invited me to join this forum with a talk, I have, of course, immediately thought about this example because it is devoted to a comparison between ancient Greece and ancient China, and this is also one of the main visions of the forum. So, okay, so I will now compare Rošker and Zeno of Elea through the problem of the flying, through the perspective of the flying arrow problem, but and also with the help of the sublation method, but because of the time limitations, I will also, of course, condense these 8 phases into 4 crucial phases. So we will first try to define the similarities of both approaches. Then we will identify differences within these similarities and link them to the 2 respective referential frameworks into which both philosophies we are dealing with are embedded. Then in the next step, we will try to establish a dialectical relation of mutual complementarity between the 2 comparata by eliminating certain elements and preserving others. And the 4th and last step is then the sublation as a creative shift, sublation as a in the more narrow sense, and this shift will hopefully offer us a new perspective or a new idea, and this is actually the goal of the sublation method. Okay, so let's proceed now to Rošker and Zeno of Elea. As most of you know, Zeno was a member of the pre-Socratic school, and he lived in the 5th century. And Rošker was a member of the so-called School of Name. This is a school that was dealing mainly with problems of semantic logic in ancient China. He was born around 50 years after Zeno's death, but we can somehow see that in a grand view, in a grand scale, they were, of course, contemporaries. So many of if one reads the fragments, they are both preserved, okay, of course, only in fragments. And if one reads the fragments of Rošker, we can see very quickly that many of those fragments are strongly reminiscent of the sayings of Zeno of the Eleatic school. So from his, for instance, 10 postulates of all that exists, it is clear that Rošker derives his theorem from the assumption of the organic and structural connectedness of all that exists. Of course, Zeno also assumes the inseparable, actually, interconnectedness of everything that exists. But unlike Rošker, he sees this existential interconnectedness as the expression of undivided, of a kind of undivided and unchanging wholeness. So, for instance, this flying arrow problem is not the only similarity that can be detected in their work. For instance, this fragment is also very similar when Rošker says, 一尺之锤，日取其半，万事不减。Which means if we take a stick that is 1 chi long, and if we cut of it half of it every day, we shall never come to the end. And somehow something very similar says also Zeno in his story about the Achilles and the slower, which are competing in which are joining a running competition. So, of course, it is from the beginning very clear that this slower will actually be that he is much slower than Achilles. And later on, this slower was renamed into a turtle because it is much more charming if we speak about Achilles, competition between Achilles and the turtle than only Achilles and the slower. But in the original story, of course, Zeno was talking only about the slower. And the slower had a head start of a few meters in the race, so he was already a few meters ahead when Achilles started the race. But then Zeno says the slower runner will never be overtaken by the swiftest, since the pursuer must first reach the point from which the pursuit started. And so the slower must always be ahead. So, yeah. So, although Huyshe proceeds from a relativist understanding of time and space, and Zeno from the endeavor to negate the possibility of movement and change, there is a similarity of both in both propositions regarding their basic understanding between of the relation between infinity and finality. They both proceed from the hypothesis that spatial length is not reducible to minimal units, but is infinitely reducible. And now let's proceed then to the core question of our presentation, namely to the problem of the flying arrow. So, yeah. And the research question through which we will look at this problem is actually, do flying arrows move? And the sub-question, because a question must be a research question in sublation method, must be relational. What is the relation between movement and stillness? So it is somehow similar, because both of them were talking about this question. They are concerned with the observation of flying arrows and the mechanics of flying arrows, namely with the question whether they move or not. So let's take a look. So, yeah, what is Huyshe's hypothesis in this regard is, he says, 诸使之极，而有不行不止之事. So the problem with the tip of the flying arrow is that there is a time in which they both are moving, and they both the problem with the flying arrow is that there is a time in which it moves and it doesn't move at the same time. So in Zeno, he simply says the flying arrow is at rest. So Huyshe says, no, there is a time when it does not move, nor does it stand still. So he negates actually both things, movement and non-movement. So the first step of the sublation method, we will now look for the similarities among these both of these comparata, or between the ways how these two philosophers, which were living in geographically very distant places from each other, well, where is the similarity actually? When Zeno says the flying arrow is at rest, and Huyshe that it is not at rest, but it does not move. also. So, but if he negates both movement and stillstand, if Huischer says it does not move and at the same time it does not stand still, it also means in a logical reversion that he says that it is moving and not moving at the same time. We can exemplify, or we can maybe better understand that if we think about the antinomy that was formulated by the Moist school. This is another school of logicians from the ancient Chinese past, when they spoke about the problem of a herd in which were oxen and horses. And they said a herd with oxen and horses cannot be called a herd of oxen, and it cannot be called a herd of horses because it consists of both, right? So if there is a herd that cannot be called the herd of oxen or the herd of horses, it is clear that it includes both oxen and horses. And now, if we project this antinomy to Huischer's problem of the flying arrow, we can see that in his view, the flying arrow is not moving and not at rest, but at the same time it moves and it is at rest. So there is a similarity, actually, that they both say that a flying arrow is at rest. Although Huischer, of course, at the same time, simultaneously says that it is also not at rest. It also moves. But actually, the similarity of the two statements is on the second glimpse quite superficial, for it only rests on the fact that both philosophers want to investigate or are curious about the spatial, temporal, and mechanic state of a flying arrow, and on the fact that their arguments differ from what we commonly assume about the state of flying arrows, because, of course, our senses clearly tell us that it is moving. A flying arrow is flying from one place to another. It seems to be completely clear that it moves. So, and their replies are actually unconventional. Both replies are unconventional in this regard. So, but if the similarity is only apparent, where are then the differences? In the next phase of applying the method of sublation, we identify differences. And as I said, not the differences in how the two philosophers approach this question, but between the similarities that were established in the previous step. So as already noted, these similarities are only superficial. The differences within them can be discerned by connecting each statement to the specific referential framework into which it is embedded. So Zeno starts from the referential framework whose basic paradigm is the unchanging, namely static, nature of being. Huischer's paradox, by contrast, is situated within the dynamic context of processual philosophy, a fundamental paradigm shaped by referential frameworks underlying most classical Chinese philosophies. So the differences, let's take a closer look to these differences. Well, Zeno clearly follows the referential framework of the pre-Socratic school, namely Parmenides' school, which advocated a static view of reality based on the concept of being. Since every object or entity, in his view, is a form of being identical with itself, they're all necessarily immovable and static. Zeno was a faithful disciple of Parmenides. So in Parmenides, and therefore he sought to confirm his teacher's theory that reality is one, indivisible and immovable. With this view, Zeno actually highlighted the impossibility of change and motion. Thus, for any form of being in this totality, there can be neither a change of space nor a change in time, right? So therefore, the motion of the flying arrow is in the reality actually nothing more but the sum of innumerable static sections of space. It is not motion. In this way, Zeno actually denies the continuity of motion by dividing it into a series of successive, mutually isolated sequences of static space. But for Huyshe, on the other hand, for Huyshe, whose philosophy is embedded into the framework of dynamic continuity of existence, every object or entity has a multifaceted nature and can change independence of the viewpoints of the observance, which is always of the observer, which is always relative, of course. Huyshe's proposition is relativistic, which means that stillstand is not absolute, as in Zenon's view. However, due to relativity, his basic paradigm, namely the paradigm of change and motion, is of course also not absolute. It can only exist in some kind of a dialectical relation with stillstand. So what kind of dialectical relation is this? So let's proceed to the third step of the sublation method. We try in this step to establish a kind of dialectics of mutual complementarity between the two comparata by eliminating certain elements of the comparisons and preserving others, which seems to us to be maybe more somehow constructive. So Huyshe's proposition includes Zeno's argument, but due to its insufficiency, it also negates it. Zeno argues that the flying arrow stands still. In Huyshe's view, it stands still and it moves at the same time. What do we preserve and what do we actually eliminate from these conflicting statements? And how can we establish a mutual complementarity between the two ideas? Is that possible even? Given that Zeno categorically denies motion on the basis of a cosmology that is grounded in being and identity, while Huyshe conceives it as a relative and correlative within the processual philosophy of becoming, their mutual complementarity cannot rest on any ontological overlap. These two ontologies are just apparently too different. So we shall therefore eliminate the ontological approach and retain the methodological one as the basis for a further analysis. Although Zeno and Huyshe begin from opposing ontological premises, their paradoxes perform structurally complementary functions within the cognitive process of conceptualizing motion. So in this phase, the ontological level of discussion is suspended and removed from the analysis. what remains and is preserved is the methodological dimension, the mode of analytical reasoning through which both thinkers, both philosophers conceptualize motion. Yeah, so for Zeno's reasoning operates within logic of identity. The arrow must remain entirely identical with itself at every moment of its flight. Because identity is defined as a strict self-sameness, any change would violate it, right? Therefore, true motion appears impossible. Huyshe, on the other hand, approaches the same phenomenon from a dynamic relational viewpoint. The arrow moves and stands still simultaneously, and nothing of the two. And this coexistence does not indicate contradiction, but complementarity. The unity of two interdependent states that define one another within a processual continuum. How can these two approaches be dialectically integrated and sublated? Let's take a look. And this is the last phase of this condensed sublation method. So at this stage, the analytical process reaches a decisive reversal. The central question now becomes, how can the two opposing perspectives be integrated in a way that Zeno's principle of the arrow's identity, so that means its unchanging stillness, is preserved, while Huyshe's insight into the simultaneous movement and stillstand is likewise maintained, without allowing the two approaches to collapse into a mutually exclusive contradiction. So this is the sublation in the narrow sense, the sublational shift, we could say, which occurs because of the tension that was accumulated between the two comparata during the process of their dialectical interaction. So how now to approach this problem? When I thought then about this problem, I remembered somehow one of the many different interpretations of this Huyshe's fragment, because in Zeno's case, it is more clear when where it comes from, but in Huyshe's paradox, it retains much more paradoxical nature. So I remembered one interpretation. It goes back to Sima Biao from the Jin dynasty. He was a historian, and he said that this can be actually understood through the binary category of Xing and Shi, form and potential. So the arrow possesses a stable form, the structural configuration that defines its identity, and a dynamic potential, the internal force or tendency that generates its movement. Within this interpretative framework, Zeno's insistence on the arrow's immobility corresponds to the preservation of form, whereas Huyshe's affirmation of motion corresponds to the activation of potential. The integration achieved through sublation does not erase either standpoint. Instead, it somehow reconfigures both as interdependent dimensions of one and the same dynamic reality. So Zeno's insight is retained as the recognition that all motion presupposes a momentary form, a configuration that makes change intelligible. Huyshe's insight is retained as the recognition of the fact that every form is internally animated by potential, a principle of transformation that prevents form from becoming absolute. So, and what is now the new perspective that comes out from this whole process of comparing the two philosophers with the method of sublation? We are supposed to get a new insight, or at least to look at this basic research question through a new perspective. So this new perspective emerging from this dialectical integration shows that such reconciliation is possible only within a dynamic framework. It cannot be possible within a static framework. Dynamic systems, and the insight is somehow also connected to the fact that dynamic systems can incorporate static elements as momentary configurations within a continuous process. But static systems, by definition, cannot accommodate dynamism without negating themselves and thereby collapsing the very basis of ontology on which they are actually founded. So this asymmetry reveals the essential or the most important direction of the sublation process. The static ontology of being is transcended and preserved within the dynamic ontology of becoming. Thus, the paradox of the flying arrow is no longer a contradiction between rest and motion, but a manifestation of their inseparable unity within the self-articulation of movement, or within the self-articulating movement of reality. Yeah. So, so to conclude, I think that the application of the method of sublation was crucial here, at least for me, to come to this new perspective or to this new insight, because it allowed the paradox to be understood not as a contradiction, to be resolved through exclusion, but a moment of tension that has to be integrated, right? So through sublation, the opposing views of Zeno and Huyshe are preserved and redefined within a higher conceptual unity, and they reveal in this way also that motion and rest, form and potential are mutually conditioning moments of one dynamic reality. In a broader sense, of course, this demonstrates why the method of sublation is also can also be important in transcultural philosophy, because it enables us to engage with divergent, different referential frameworks, not through synthesis that would erase differences, but through a dynamic process that preserves and transforms each of them within a shared horizon of understanding. So in this way, sublation provides a methodological key for constructing genuine philosophical dialogues across traditions without reducing one to the terms of the other. So, and with this humble hope, I would like to conclude this presentation, and I would like to thank you very much for your patient listening, and also, of course, to open the space for your questions, constructive critiques, remarks, comments, discussion. So thank you very much.